Good morning. So, back when the world was young and I was in high school in Southern California in the mid-70s, I was a distance runner. I ran cross country and track. And every fall during cross country season, we would have some practices canceled because of smog advisories. People were advised to stay indoors and avoid exertion. In other words, basically the air, you should avoid breathing the air if at all possible. It was because it was bad for you. In those days, there were over 100 stage 1 smog alerts in the LA basin every year in, year out. In the past decade, the number of stage 1 smog alerts has been 0. There has been a lot of progress. It's a different atmosphere in Southern California. How did that happen? The answer is boring. Let me just start with the words Southern California Associations of Government, and you can set your snooze alarm. But the fact is that it's over years and decades, all kinds of agencies and dozens of municipal governments, county governments, state government, federal agencies, legislatures, business interests had a lot of meetings and just chiseled away at a very complicated problem, and it worked. The warnings that you heard over the years from conservatives that dealing with this problem would smother the economy under the heavy thumb of clean air regulations didn't really happen. The warnings you heard from liberals that you could not deal with this problem without starting to wean ourselves from cars, develop more of a mass transit practice, start to make housing denser and closer to workplaces. That so didn't happen. There are more people driving more cars, more miles in Southern California than ever before, and yet you can breathe. The air is clean. So something has worked. Let's roll forward now to the present day and look at climate change, for example. Huge problem. Stakes are really very high. The complex of jurisdictions of public and private interests around the world is almost unimaginably complex. I have no idea, how we will solve this problem or adapt to it, probably some combination of the two. But I do know this, we have solved problems like this before. Do you remember the hole in the ozone? Flashing back to the 70s, just quick refresher, ozone, that layer that protects us from the sun's most harmful rays. Scientists in the 70s began surmising that aerosols and refrigerants, CFCs, were eroding it. Then in the 80s, they discovered that, in fact, there was this huge gaping hole in the ozone layer over the Antarctic that was growing rapidly. Again, a polarized issue. There were some scientists warned that not only were we at risk of epidemics of skin cancer and cataracts, but also basically all of biological life could be affected in unforeseen ways. On the other hand, we had Interior Secretary Don Hodel suggest that we could just wear hats and slather on the sunscreen and avoid regulation. But those divides were bridged. The world actually got its act together. We had the Montreal Protocol in 1987, and it worked. Last fall, a scientist published a study showing that the ozone layer was in fact healing over, and we would be back to historical normal by mid-century. So stuff works. Even government can work. So what goes wrong? Why does it feel like we're so far apart and so dysfunctional? There are many answers to that question. Here's one: fear. and its close cousins, pessimism and cynicism. Pessimism that we can't solve these problems, that we can't work it out. Cynicism that the other guy is not operating in good faith. And fear that our team will lose, probably, and they will win, probably by cheating. And our interests or our values will get shunted to the wrong side of history. There are entire industries built around riling people up and stoking these fears that liberals or corporations or bankers or feminazis or radical environmentalists or truthers or birthers or creationist know-nothings, whatever, fill in your boogeyman here, we are basically putting their agenda over on the rest of us and taking our hard-won civilization down a blind alley to get mugged. So cable TV, for example, left and right, has a business model largely around creating ideological, cultural, tribal divisions, creating that us and them. Many political fundraising mailers are much worse because they're really outside sort of the normal scrutiny. The results can be a very stark, black and white, good and evil, us versus them view of the world. The mechanics of politics are part of the problem too. When you have chronically low turnouts, as we do in this country, the game has become less about winning over the swing voter in the middle and more about mobilizing your base, get them to turn out. And that produces a different kind of politics. Also, we have, at the national level at least, we have a very competitive political system. That's a good thing. But the result, when you have major power swings from in control of Congress and the White House, and some very close elections, it creates a more hyper and aggressively partisan politics because everybody feels the other guy breathing down their neck all the time. So there's a lot at stake. So what can we do about it? Here's some of what we're trying to do as a news organization. Two things. One, to promote understanding across divides, not agreement. Agreement's wonderful, but that's not our role. But understanding of the other guy, what they're thinking, what the world looks like to them. And then to look for progress wherever we can find it. Things that are working, things that have worked. On promoting understanding across divides, some examples. We recently did a story on the families of transgender kids. Spending some time with these families, you see how the world looks to them is that they have a child who is going through what can be extraordinarily difficult emotional and social issues. So much so that suicide rates are very high with these kids. And that being in a supportive family can make an incredible difference, enough so that, in fact, the suicide rates are cut by 3/4 when you have family support. This was not a one-sided story. We also quoted people who have qualms about the growing acceptance of transgenderism, from Pope Francis to some other religious figures, to some psychiatrists, to some feminists. But those that we talked to and quoted were coming from a place of compassion, because our purpose was not to create a train wreck for entertainment value. Our purpose was to try to get more of us to see how the world looks from different standpoints and across these divides. Another example, obviously we have covered a lot of the dismay and frustration around police killings of young black men in this country, and we've tried to plumb that with some depth. We have also looked at how difficult it is in many cases for police, and in fact how many police departments in this country have made incredible progress on these issues, especially at the higher sort of police chief level, and it's kind of working down through their departments. And you see a lot of much improved practices. I'll mention one more case. At the beginning of this Congress early this year, when Mitch McCloskey took over the Senate, we did a profile of him. And what we found, beyond some of the red meat rhetoric that he's become famous for, is a guy who actually, on a long-term basis, is deeply committed, profoundly committed to the very unsexy business of making the Senate run better as a more open and high-functioning place. And I think that if you were a liberal or a moderate and you read that story, you would actually feel a little less bleak about the U.S. Senate. I think if you were a conservative and read that story, you might feel better as well. And in fact, by the way, in this first half year or so, that new atmosphere has borne out in the Senate. It is, by various measures, a more open and a more functional, and in fact, even a more bipartisan place than it has been in recent years. They are still, of course, much despised by the American people. But looking for progress is one of the important things that we do as a news organization. And when you start looking for it, you realize quickly that progress is a hugely underreported story. Just throw out a smattering of almost random metrics. In the last generation, in the last 25 years, in this country, violent crime has been cut in half. Teen pregnancy across all racial groups has been cut in half. Highway fatalities per mile traveled has been cut by 2/3. More globally, this past year, we recently found out, was the first year when the world had net positive economic growth and no increase in global emissions. Again, that list just goes on and on. In fact, every week we now publish a map of the world filled in with points of progress from various countries and continents. A couple quick examples from the most recent one. We learned that China reduced carbon emissions in the first quarter of this year by 5% year over year, and has cut coal use by 8%. We learned that the number of people in the world facing acute hunger over the last 15 years dropped by 205 million. 205 million fewer people facing acute hunger during a period when global population actually surged by over 1 billion. So, these are not trivial achievements. And they indicate pretty clearly that a lot of the things that we people do, really big things, actually work. We can solve really difficult problems. And this should be part of our worldview. First of all, because it's true, and second, because it's useful. There are lessons in it, and it gives us heart for the tasks ahead. So we're looking for these things at the Monitor, and we're actually not the only ones. There might even be something of a proto-trend out there in the media. A great example is a group called the Solutions Journalism Network. This is a small group of people, a little nonprofit. They're largely out of the New York Times, but they are working to, their thrust is to give as rigorous coverage to things that are working as to things that are not working. So they are developing and articulating a solutions-oriented journalism. They are giving workshops in newsrooms around the country. They are partnering with news organizations on projects. And so nice idea, right? But the interesting thing is that they commissioned a study with the University of Texas where they showed people one of two stories. One was focusing on a social problem, and the other one had the problem but also included people working on responses to the problem. And what they found is that the people who read the solution-oriented story were both more interested in the topic, more likely to talk about it to others, but also more likely to feel optimistic about the problem, and more likely to either get involved or donate money to organizations that were doing something about the problem. So we think that we need fear to mobilize action. Actually, maybe hope works better. If you think about it, to launch anything, you need a little bit of optimism. You need to have a sense of possibility that things can work. There's a lot of evidence out there. Thank you.